You have spent your life feeling misunderstood, but your ADHD traits might be the ultimate proof that your IQ is well above average. Since school days, you may have been labeled as the distracted student, the one who looked out the window while the teacher spoke, or perhaps as someone lazy and undisciplined to follow rigid rules. In a modern society that values conformity and continuous attention to monotonous tasks, having a mind that jumps rapidly from one thought to another is often associated with ADHD symptoms. However, what most people do not understand is that the boundary between pure genius and ADHD is extremely thin and frequently overlaps. Many brilliant minds spent years believing there was something fundamentally wrong with how they processed the world. When the brain operates at a speed far above average, it requires constant intellectual stimuli so as not to shut down. If a subject, class, or project is not challenging enough, the interest disappears in an instant. To outside observers, this looks like a clear attention deficit caused by ADHD. But often it is just the strict filter of high intelligence, refusing to spend cognitive energy on what is basic or dull. People with a high IQ exhibit behavioral patterns incredibly similar to ADHD, living the classic paradox of feeling completely out of place, questioning whether they possess a superior mind or are just losing control. But how exactly does the brain of a genius resemble an ADHD diagnosis so much in everyday functioning? The first major sign of this mental hyperactivity appears precisely when the lights go out and the outside world finally goes silent. When the clock strikes 2 in the morning and the rest of the neighborhood sleeps, your mind simply starts its main engines. For the vast majority of people, nighttime silence is an immediate invitation to sleep. But for those living on the thin line between a high IQ and ADHD, the absence of external distractions means the brain finally has free space to process everything it absorbed throughout the day. This phenomenon of nocturnal hyperactivity is frequently confused with classic anxiety or insomnia associated with ADHD, characterized by that frustrating inability to turn off thoughts and relax. However, what is really happening behind the scenes is something much more complex and fascinating. Individuals with superior intelligence possess a hyper-awareness of their environment that borders on the investigative. They instinctively capture tiny details that go completely unnoticed by the average person. The subtle creak of a door on the other side of the house, the sound pattern of an approaching bus blocks away, or even the almost invisible change in someone's body language during a quick conversation. All this massive flood of data collected in the background needs to be rigorously analyzed. Therefore, the famous overthinking that steals your precious hours of sleep is often not a mere isolated symptom of ADHD, but rather the direct result of an overheated neural processor. It is the mind trying to connect loose dots and solve complex puzzles that other people did not even know existed, especially in a fast-paced lifestyle like that of the United States, where corporate and educational culture demands a narrow and linear focus from 9 to 5. Having a brain that works in a web-like and expansive manner is deeply exhausting. Society frequently labels this restless mind as a mind affected by ADHD, assuming there is a total lack of attention, when in fact the mind is paying attention to absolutely everything at the same time. It is physically impossible to focus on just one mundane task when your brain is simultaneously calculating future probabilities, reliving past interactions to find logical flaws, and decoding every sound in the environment around you. This extreme and continuous level of information processing consumes an absurd amount of daily mental energy, leaving no drop of patience for superficialities. And it is precisely because of this constant cognitive exhaustion that one of the most striking characteristics of high IQ and ADHD manifests with full force when you are forced to start a casual conversation. Imagine the classic American scene around the office water cooler, or the casual encounter with the neighbor in the suburbs, where conversations revolve only around the weather, or the latest baseball game. For the vast majority, this exchange of trivialities is the perfect and expected social lubricant. However, for a mind operating at the intersection of a high IQ and ADHD, having to participate in this type of superficial conversation, the famous small talk, causes an almost physical aversion. This deep hatred for empty dialogues is frequently interpreted by society as arrogance, coldness, or a clear difficulty in social interaction typical of ADHD. However, the psychological reality behind this behavior is that of a brain that has an insatiable hunger for depth, logic, and challenging intellectual stimuli. When things are learned and understood extremely quickly, the mystery of any subject dissolves in a matter of seconds. And, for an individual with strong ADHD traits and superior intelligence, the exact moment something ceases to be a cognitive challenge is the exact moment it becomes unbearably boring. And, for an individual with strong ADHD traits and superior intelligence, the exact moment something ceases to be a cognitive challenge is the exact moment it becomes unbearably boring. This immediate loss of interest is one of the central points where the ADHD label and genius traits overlap the most in everyday life. Leaders and educators usually see this behavior as a total inability to maintain focus or a glaring failure in sustained attention. But the truth is that the brain did not lose focus randomly. It has simply already processed all the relevant information, solved the central problem, and is begging for a new puzzle that justifies its high expenditure of mental energy. Talking about everyday amenities when the mind demands to debate only the direct facts, always seeking the crystal clear truth of things, is like forcing a high-performance engine to run in the slowest possible gear. The direct consequence of this extreme aversion to useless social noise is a constant search for environments where precision and clarity thrive. Silence comes to be seen as pure gold for those with this profile, far from the distractions of meaningless conversations. And ironically, it is exactly this absolute need to silence external banalities to organize one's thoughts logically that gives rise to one of the most peculiar habits judged and misunderstood by most people. You have probably been caught by surprise muttering to yourself while walking down the empty hallway at home, or perhaps even arguing emphatically with the mirror while formulating an important decision. And the moment someone witnesses this, comes that classic look of strangeness and the quick, silent questioning of your sanity. Talking to yourself out loud, and even answering yourself with conviction and different intonations, carries a huge historical stigma of being something insane, being easily seen by any observer as a psychiatric disorder or an eccentric compulsion resulting from severe ADHD symptoms. However, the true role of verbalizing your complex thoughts on a daily basis is to act as one of the most sophisticated tools and a cognitive hack to tame a chaotic mind that works at very high speed, connecting pure intelligence to traits of typical ADHD neurological functioning, instead of just being a tick without any clear purpose. Openly talking to yourself incredibly helps in reasoning and planning when the head seems too full of ideas at the same time, a constant scenario for highly gifted minds. Individuals in the highest IQ range usually use this instinctive method of information processing, not because they are crazy and have lost their sense of reality, but because this action divides the weight of their extreme intellectual capacity by simulating an external dialogue of critical argumentation. This ingenious process of articulating things out loud acts as an efficient control panel and personal audit to debate their inevitable negative and positive biases facing some challenging problem. For a brain prone to getting lost in the endless webs of analytical overthinking in an accelerated way like the ADHD brain, externalizing this technical analysis removes the data from abstract chaos, forcing it to obey the linear structure of language and providing an infinitely superior and more logical result than any hasty decision. And it is because it works so well as an anchor of mental clarity in the American corporate world and in daily resolution that highly intelligent people rely on this tool. Thinking out loud and organizing mental chaos with such force, however, is merely a symptom of the wear and tear caused by continuous external interaction with a reality that operates in a lower gear. Dealing with people and less exact information throughout the weeks inevitably requires the payment of a much more silent mental toll. The mental bill for the exceptional and fast reasoning capacity invariably arrives brutally through complete social exhaustion. And dealing with this every day is not so simple. The profound and palpable mental exhaustion at the end of a single office shift, surrounded by external stimuli, is a painful reality faced and felt by all those with high IQ alongside ADHD traits, like a meaningless divine punishment in current capitalist society. Because while the average worker passes quite lightly through the constant environmental noise in big cities, and engages naturally in the superficial back and forth of colleagues, the neurodivergent brain without efficient filters works almost like a huge and hungry antenna, capturing everything at once. Every flickering light from the television, every irritable tone of voice in the background, and the endless litany about what they will eat for lunch instantly overload the mind's main circuit. This is the exact reason why the ADHD diagnosis seems to always be lurking. Because to the shallowest outside observer, this strong aversion to groups of people sounds like depressive isolation, pure chronic laziness of interaction, the worst of weirdness, or classic indiscipline since school. However, this inevitable exhaustion is actually the very high biological price of intelligence, always functioning above the normal line of reasoning. Solitude is fundamental for any bearer of this neurodivergence to recover. The need for physical isolation in American adult life, whether locking oneself in a dark room without artificial stimuli, or seeking untouched silence, preferably deep in nature, is not a romantic escape to a sad life. On the contrary, actively fleeing to isolated spaces, where nature gently stirs and speaks in green silence, like a healing balm at the end of the day, works strictly as an important psychiatric survival mechanism essential for recalibrating the brilliant person's information system. It is literally temporarily deactivating the heavy machine, putting on headphones to reduce the auditory textures of the noisy suburban street, hiding for long minutes in the office bathroom away from supervise, and recharging fragile levels of dopamine and energy, only then to be able to re-enter that same world and try to be functional for a few more hours. When this scenario of exhaustion and constant noise becomes almost permanent, with no possibility of biological rest, signs of stress worsen at the speed of light for everyone who shares these habits, explaining so evidently why it is impossible to dissociate these brilliant little eccentricities from a very specific pattern, without an unaware psychiatrist recommending some medication focused on the artificial focus of mindfulness to the environment. It is because of this constant confusion that so many singular minds end up in the office receiving a quick ADHD diagnosis. But the great verdict modern science and psychology are beginning to reveal is that embracing your neurodivergent mind can be the most liberating step of your entire life. Having these intense characteristics that often perfectly mimic ADHD, or even actually being on the spectrum, does not diminish your intelligence in absolutely any way. In fact, as we have seen so far, these traits frequently walk hand in hand with an IQ well above the population average. That painful and constant feeling of inadequacy that you have carried from the noisy high school hallways to the endless meetings of the American corporate world does not mean you are broken, or that you urgently need to be fixed to fit society's standard. It just means that your operating system was programmed to process data in a much deeper, faster, and more complex way than the minds around you can keep up with. You are not just a weird, lazy, antisocial, or chronically distracted person because of ADHD. You are, indeed, the owner of a brain that operates at a much higher frequency, which requires true intellectual stimuli, hates shallow conversations, and need strict periods of silence and isolation to avoid collapsing from information overload. The world will always seem extremely noisy to someone who pays attention to absolutely everything all the time. Therefore, the next time someone gives you a weird look because you are solving problems by talking out loud to yourself or avoiding at all costs the superficial and meaningless neighborhood chat, remember that genius almost never looks like normality. Your supposed attention deficit is, in reality, your greatest intellectual advantage in disguise. If you recognized yourself in these ADHD traits, combined with high intelligence, and want to continue discovering how your peculiar mind really works behind the scenes, subscribe to the channel right now. Leave your like and share this video with that friend who also constantly questions themselves and needs to understand, once and for all, that they are not alone on this thin and fascinating line of neurodivergence.